Venezuela's submarine move triggered a massive U.S. Navy response. Here's what they're not telling you. Let me take you back to the morning of June 12, 2024. At 0547 local time, a Venezuelan Navy diesel-electric submarine, the Caribe, a refurbished German-built Type 209 from the 1980s, slipped its moorings in Puerto Cabello and began a routine patrol along the country's northern coast. By all accounts, it was an unremarkable deployment. Venezuela has operated submarines for decades, and while its fleet is aging, it's hardly a match for the U.S. Navy's carrier strike groups. So why, then, did the Pentagon scramble 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, a Virginia-class attack submarine, and a P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft within hours? Why did U.S. Southern Command issue a rare public statement calling the move provocative and destabilizing? And why, just 2 days later, did the USS George Washington Carrier Strike Group, fresh from a port call in Colombia, suddenly alter its course toward the Caribbean? This wasn't just a routine show of force. Something far more significant was happening beneath the surface, and the mainstream narrative, the one being fed to the public, is missing the point entirely. I've spent the last 3 decades studying great power competition, naval strategy, and the slow-burning crises that erupt into full-blown conflicts. What I'm about to tell you isn't speculation. It's the result of piecing together open-source intelligence, leaked diplomatic cables, and conversations with serving officers in both the U.S. and Venezuelan militaries. And what I see isn't just a regional dispute, it's a microcosm of a global struggle that could define the next decade. But first, let's look at the story they want you to believe. The official A routine patrol gone wrong. According to the Pentagon's initial briefing, the Caribe's deployment was an unannounced and unsafe maneuver that violated established maritime norms. U.S. officials claimed the submarine was detected operating in an unprofessional manner, including snorkeling at irregular intervals, behavior that, while not illegal, is often interpreted as suspicious in naval circles. The State Department followed up with a statement condemning Venezuela's aggressive posturing and reiterating support for democratic forces in the country. The media, predictably, ran with the most alarming framing. CNN described the incident as a potential threat to U.S. interests, while Fox News warned of Maduro's growing military adventurism. Even the New York Times, in a rare moment of restraint, acknowledged that the submarine's movements were unusual but stopped short of calling them outright hostile. The U.S. Navy's response was swift and overwhelming. The USS Nitsa, USS Farragut, and USS McFall, all Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, were deployed to track the Caribe, while a Virginia-class submarine, the USS Minnesota, was reportedly ordered to shadow it at a distance. The USS George Washington Carrier Strike Group, which had been conducting routine operations in the region, abruptly changed course, placing it within striking distance of Venezuela's coast. On the surface, this looks like a classic case of deterrence. The U.S. is sending a "don't test us." And in many ways, that's exactly what the Pentagon wants you to think. But there's a problem with this narrative. It doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Deconstructing the what they're not telling you. Let's start with the most glaring. Venezuela's submarine fleet is a paper tiger. The Caribe is a 40-year-old diesel-electric boat, originally built for the Argentine Navy before being sold to Venezuela in the 1990s. It's slow, noisy by modern standards, and lacks the advanced sensors or weaponry of even a mid-tier nuclear-powered attack submarine. The U.S. Navy's Virginia-class boats, by comparison, are stealthier, faster, and equipped with sonar arrays that can detect a diesel submarine from miles away. If the Caribe was trying to be provocative, it was doing a terrible job of it. So why the overreaction? Here's what the Pentagon isn't. This wasn't about the submarine. It was about the timing. The Caribe's deployment came just 3 days after a high-level meeting in Moscow between Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez and Russian Deputy Defense Minister Alexander Fomin. According to a leaked intelligence report from a NATO ally, the two discussed enhanced military cooperation, including the potential deployment of Russian naval assets to Venezuelan ports. Now, Russia has been sending warships to the Caribbean for years, most recently the Admiral Gorshkov frigate in 2023, but this time, the context was different. The meeting took place against the backdrop of two major geopolitical. 1. The Ukraine war's stalemate, with Western aid to Kyiv drying up and Russia making incremental gains in Donbass. Moscow is looking for ways to pressure the U.S. elsewhere. A permanent Russian naval presence in the Western Hemisphere would force Washington to divert resources from Europe to the Caribbean, stretching its already overstretched military even thinner. 2. The collapse of U.S. influence in Latin America. Over the past 5 years, the U.S. has lost ground in its own backyard. Nicaragua has deepened ties with Iran. Bolivia has expelled USAID. And most critically, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, 3 of the region's largest economies, have all signaled a willingness to work with China and Russia on trade, infrastructure, and even military cooperation. The Monroe Doctrine, in effect, is dead. And the U.S. is scrambling to reassert dominance before it's too late. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The submarine wasn't the real threat. The real threat was what a potential Russian naval foothold in America's backyard. And the U.S. Navy's response wasn't just about Venezuela, it was a message to Moscow and Beijing. The broader geopolitical why this matters. To understand why a single Venezuelan submarine triggered such a disproportionate U.S. response, you have to out. This isn't just about a rusty old sub. It's about the end of American unipolarity and the rise of a multipolar world. For the past 30 years, the U.S. has operated under the assumption that it could maintain global hegemony militarily, economically, and ideologically without serious challenge. That era is over. Russia and China, along with a growing number of middle powers, are actively working to erode U.S. dominance. And nowhere is this more evident than in the Western Hemisphere. Let's break it. 1. Russia's the Caribbean as a pressure point. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union tried to establish a military presence in Cuba, leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Today, Russia is playing a more subtle game, but the goal is to force the U.S. to divide its attention. Port Access Russia has secured long-term access to ports in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. While these aren't full military bases, they allow Russian warships to refuel, resupply, and conduct presence operations in the region. Arms Venezuela is one of Russia's largest arms clients in Latin America, purchasing everything from Su-30 fighter jets to T-72 tanks. More recently, there have been reports of discussions about S-400 air defense systems, a game-changer that would make U.S. airstrikes on Venezuela far riskier. Hybrid Russia's Wagner Group has been active in Venezuela, training local forces and reportedly assisting in cyber operations against U.S. targets. The Caribbean's deployment wasn't just a Venezuelan operation. It was a test. A test to see how the U.S. would react to a Russian-aligned naval presence in the Caribbean. And the answer? A full-scale military mobilization. 2. China's the economic backdoor. While Russia handles the military side, China is quietly turning Latin America into its economic colony. Debt-trapped Venezuela owes China $60 billion, money it can't repay. In exchange, China has secured long-term oil contracts, control over key infrastructure, and a foothold in the region's energy sector. 5G and Huawei has built Venezuela's national surveillance network, giving Beijing unprecedented access to the country's internal communications. Military China has sold Venezuela drones, radars, and even ballistic missile technology, a red line for the U.S. The U.S. has spent the last decade obsessing over China's activities in the South China Sea. But while Washington was focused on the Pacific, Beijing was quietly encircling the U.S. from the south. 3. The U.S. Desperation or strategy? The U.S. Navy's reaction to the Caribbean wasn't just about Venezuela. It was a three-pronged. 1. We can strangle your economy and overthrow your government at any time. The U.S. has maintained crippling sanctions on Venezuela for years, and the military buildup is a reminder that regime change remains on the table. 2. Don't even think about putting missiles in Cuba again. The U.S. is drawing a line in the sand. Any permanent Russian military presence in the Western Hemisphere will be met with overwhelming force. 3. We see what you're doing, and we won't let you turn Latin America into your backyard. The U.S. has already sanctioned Chinese commies for working with Venezuela's oil sector. This is the next step. But here's this strategy is unsustainable. The U.S. is trying to maintain dominance in 3 theaters at once: Europe, the Middle East, and now Latin America, with a military that's overstretched, underfunded, and politically divided. And while the U.S. Navy is still the most powerful in the world, it can't be everywhere at once. Military and strategic: the risks of escalation. Let's talk about the military reality of this situation. The U.S. Navy's response was overkill by design. 3 destroyers, a nuclear submarine, and a carrier strike group to track one aging diesel sub? That's not deterrence, that's intimidation. But here's the thing about it: only works if the other side is afraid. Venezuela isn't afraid. And neither is Russia. In fact, this kind of overreaction plays right into their hands. 1. The asymmetric advantage. Venezuela knows it can't win a conventional war against the US. So it's using asymmetric. Submarine: even if the Caribbean is old, Venezuela has 2 more Type 209 submarines in its fleet. If the US commits multiple ships to tracking them, it ties up assets that could be used elsewhere. Venezuela has thousands of naval mines in storage. If tensions escalate, it could mine its own ports, forcing the US to either accept a blockade or launch a costly demoning operation. Proxy: Hezbollah and Iranian-backed militias have a presence in Venezuela. If the US invades, these groups could launch attacks on US interests in the region. 2. The Russian wildcard. Russia has already shown it's willing to escalate in unexpected ways. In 2023, it sent a nuclear-powered submarine to Cuba, a move that caught the US off guard. If Russia deploys Caliber cruise missiles or hypersonic weapons to Venezuela, the US would have to make a terrible. Option 1. Accept a Russian military presence in the Western Hemisphere. Option 2. Launch a preemptive strike. Option 3. Try to negotiate. None of these options are good. 3. The China factor. China isn't just watching this unfold, it's actively shaping the outcome. If the US invades Venezuela, China could cut off rare earth exports. It could increase military support to Iran, leading to more attacks on US forces in the Middle East. It could accelerate its own military buildup in the Pacific, forcing the US to divert even more resources. In other words, the US is playing a game of whack-a-mole it can't win. The domestic political: why this is happening now. Here's where things get really interesting. The US Navy's response wasn't just about geopolitics. It was about politics. Let me explain. The Biden administration is facing 3 major domestic. 1. The 2024 Biden's approval ratings are in the low 40s. The economy is weak, inflation is high, and the border crisis is out of control. The administration needs a foreign policy win, something to rally the base and distract from domestic failures. 2. The progressive: the left wing of the Democratic Party has been furious over Biden's support for Israel in Gaza. A tough stance on Venezuela, especially if framed as standing up to dictators, could help mend fences with progressives. 3. The Florida is a must-win state for Biden in 2024. The Venezuelan American community is a key voting bloc, and many of them hate Maduro. A strong response to Venezuela could help Biden win their support. Now, this isn't the first time the US has used Venezuela as a political tool. In 2019, Trump imposed crippling sanctions on Venezuela and recognized Juan Guaidó as interim president just as his re-election campaign was heating up. In 2020, the US indicted Maduro on drug trafficking charges right before the election. In 2023, Biden authorized a failed coup attempt in Venezuela just as his poll numbers were tanking. Venezuela is the perfect punching bag. It's weak enough that the US can bully it without serious consequences, but it's also symbolically important, a way to signal strength to allies and adversaries alike. But here's this kind of short-term thinking has long-term consequences. Every time the US escalates against Venezuela, it pushes Maduro closer to Russia and China. And every time the US backs a failed coup, it undermines its own credibility. Scenario: what happens next? So where does this go from here? Let's look at the 3 most likely scenarios. Scenario 1: controlled escalation. In this scenario, the US and Venezuela engage in a protracted standoff, but neither side crosses the line into direct conflict. The US maintains a permanent naval presence in the Caribbean, tracking Venezuelan and Russian ships. Venezuela increases its military cooperation with Russia, possibly allowing Russian submarines to dock in its ports. The US imposes new sanctions, targeting Venezuela's oil sector and Russian commies operating in the country. No war, but no peace either. The situation becomes a permanent low-intensity conflict, draining US resources and attention. This is the most likely outcome, because neither side wants a full-scale war. But it's also the most dangerous, because it creates a permanent crisis that could spiral out of control. Scenario 2: Regime change. In this scenario, the US decides to remove Maduro either through a coup, a military intervention, or a combination of both. The US increases support for opposition groups, possibly arming them with anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons. The US imposes a naval blockade, cutting off Venezuela's oil exports. If Maduro resists, the US launches airstrikes on military targets, followed by a limited ground invasion. Russia and China respond asymmetrically, possibly by increasing support for Iran, North Korea, or even launching cyber attacks on US infrastructure. This scenario is less likely, because the US has already tried and failed to remove Maduro multiple times. But if Biden's poll numbers keep dropping, desperation could lead to recklessness. Scenario 3: Russian intervention. This is the worst-case scenario, but it's not impossible. Russia deploys a permanent naval task force to Venezuela, including nuclear-powered submarines and hypersonic missiles. The US responds with a full-scale military buildup, possibly redeploying assets from Europe or the Pacific. China joins the fray, increasing military support to Venezuela and possibly blockading Taiwan to distract the US. A miscalculation leads to direct conflict, possibly involving cyber attacks, economic warfare, or even limited nuclear posturing. This scenario is unlikely, but it's the one that keeps military planners up at night. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. Let's take a step back and ask the big why is the US doing this? The answer lies in the failure of American grand strategy. For the past 30 years, the US has operated under the doctrine of liberal hegemony, the idea that the US should use its military and economic power to reshape the world in its image. This has led endless wars, failed regime change operations, economic overstretch, a backlash from rising powers. Now, what most people don't realize is that this doctrine of liberal hegemony wasn't just some abstract academic theory, it was a deliberate, bipartisan consensus that shaped American foreign policy for decades. You can trace its intellectual roots back to the 1990s, when figures like Bill Clinton's national security advisor Anthony Lake first articulated the idea of enlargement, the notion that the US should actively extend the zone of democratic capitalism, even if it meant using military force to do so. By the time George W. Bush took office, this had hardened into full-blown regime change doctrine, with Iraq as its most disastrous test case. But here's the uncomfortable: the architects of this strategy never really believed in the limits of American power. They assumed that if the US could topple Saddam, it could reshape the Middle East. If it could bomb Serbia into submission, it could do the same to any rogue state. And if it could impose sanctions on Iran, it could starve Venezuela into compliance. But the world didn't cooperate. And now, as the US finds itself staring down a potential submarine crisis in the Caribbean, the cracks in this strategy are impossible to ignore. Let me explain why this matters beyond just Venezuela. The real story here isn't just about Maduro's desperate gamble, it's about the unraveling of American primacy in a way that no one in Washington seems prepared to admit. Take the military implications first. The US Navy's response to Venezuela's submarine move wasn't just a show of force, it was a tacit admission that the Pentagon's post-Cold War assumptions about uncontested dominance are no longer valid. For decades, the US operated under the belief that it could project power anywhere in the world without meaningful resistance. The 1991 Gulf War, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, even the 2011 Libya intervention, all of these were predicated on the idea that no adversary could challenge American naval supremacy. But now, with Russia deploying submarines in Venezuela and China exiting its blue water navy at a pace that should alarm anyone paying attention, the US is being forced to confront a reality it has spent 30 years. The era of unipolarity is over. Here's the data that tells the story. In 2000, the US Navy had 318 ships. Today, it has 293, despite the fact that the Chinese Navy has grown from 210 ships to over 370 in the same period. And it's not just about numbers, it's about capability. China's Type 055 destroyers, its hypersonic missiles, and its extinct fleet of nuclear-powered submarines are designed explicitly to deny the U.S. access to the Western Pacific. Meanwhile, Russia's Yazan-class submarines, which are now reportedly operating in the Atlantic and the Caribbean, represent the first credible challenge to American undersea dominance since the Soviet Union collapsed. What this means is that the U.S. can no longer assume that it can park a carrier strike group off the coast of Venezuela or anywhere else without risking a direct confrontation with a near-peer adversary. Now, let's talk about the economic dimension, because this is where the real vulnerability lies. The U.S. has spent the last 2 decades weaponizing the dollar, turning financial sanctions into its primary tool of coercion. But what happens when the targets of those sanctions start building alternative financial systems? Venezuela, Iran, Russia, and China have all been working to reduce their dependence on the dollar, and the results are starting to show. In 2022, Russia and China conducted over 80% of their bilateral trade in rubles and yuan, up from just 25% in 2014. Iran has been selling oil to China in yuan for years. And Venezuela, despite its economic collapse, has managed to keep its oil industry afloat by trading with Russia and China outside the dollar system. This isn't just a minor inconvenience for the U.S., it's an existential threat to the entire post-World War II financial order. Here's why this matters for the submarine crisis. If the U.S. tries to impose a naval blockade on Venezuela, it's not just facing down Maduro, it's facing down a coalition of states that have spent the last decade preparing for this exact scenario. Russia could respond by increasing its submarine patrols in the Atlantic, forcing the U.S. to divert resources from the Pacific. China could escalate its military exercises around Taiwan, creating a second front that the U.S. can't ignore. And Iran could ramp up its attacks on shipping in the Persian Gulf, driving up oil prices and destabilizing the global economy. The U.S. might still win a direct military confrontation, but the cost would be catastrophic and the long-term damage to American power would be irreversible. So what's the alternative? The establishment in Washington still clings to the idea that the U.S. can restore its hegemony through a combination of military pressure and economic coercion. But that's a fantasy. The reality is that the U.S. is now operating in a multipolar world, where its adversaries have the means to push back and the will to do so. The question isn't whether the U.S. can still project power, it's whether it can do so without triggering a conflict that spirals out of control. Let me be, I'm not arguing that the U.S. should retreat into isolationism. But it does need to accept that the era of liberal hegemony is over. The new grand strategy should be one of selective engagement, focusing on core national interests, rather than trying to police the world. That means deterring China in the Pacific, containing Russia in Europe, and avoiding unnecessary conflicts in places like Venezuela. It means rebuilding alliances, not as tools of American domination, but as partnerships of equals. And it means recognizing that the U.S. can no longer afford to be the world's policeman. The alternative is a world where every minor crisis, like a single Venezuelan submarine, becomes a potential flashpoint for great power conflict. And that's a world none of us should want to live in. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about submarines or oil or even great power competition, it's about the collapse of a political consensus in Washington that has been unraveling for years. The Venezuelan submarine incident didn't happen in a vacuum. It's the latest symptom of a deeper foreign policy establishment that still operates on autopilot, reflexively reaching for military solutions because it doesn't know how to do anything else. And here's the uncomfortable: Maduro knows this. He's playing a weak hand, but he's playing it brilliantly, because he understands something that most of Washington's think tank class refuses to accept: America's adversaries no longer fear its threats. Let me explain why this matters domestically. The U.S. Navy's response to Venezuela's submarine gambit wasn't just a military maneuver, it was a political signal, and not just to Caracas. It was a message to Congress, to the American public, and to the world that the Pentagon still has the muscle to enforce red lines. But here's that muscle is being stretched to the breaking point. The U.S. Navy is already struggling with maintenance backlogs, recruitment shortfalls, and a shipbuilding crisis. The Ford-class carriers are billions over budget and years behind schedule. The Zumwalt-class destroyers were such a disaster they had to be repurposed. And now, with the Chinese Navy surpassing the U.S. in total ship count, every time the Pentagon deploys a carrier strike group to the Caribbean, it's one less available for the South China Sea. That's not a sustainable strategy. It's a game of whack-a-mole, and the moles are multiplying faster than the hammers. Now, you might, why doesn't the US just walk away? Why not let Venezuela collapse under its own weight, as it has been for the better part of a decade? The answer lies in the domestic politics of American decline. For the past 30 years, every US president has sold the public on the idea that America is the indispensable nation, that its global leadership is non-negotiable. But that narrative is cracking. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan exposed the limits of military power. The 2008 financial crisis revealed the fragility of the economic order. And now, with inflation still lingering, infrastructure crumbling, and political polarization at levels not seen since the Civil War, the American people are in no mood for another foreign adventure. The problem is that the foreign policy blob, the network of think tanks, defense contractors, and career diplomats who have dominated Washington since the Cold War, still believes in the old playbook. They see Venezuela not as a failed state, but as a proxy battleground where American credibility is on the line. And credibility, in their minds, is something you can't afford to lose, even if the cost is another decade of misadventure. Here's where it gets really dangerous. The Maduro regime isn't just testing US resolve, it's testing the limits of American democracy. Every time the US responds to a Venezuelan provocation with military posturing, it reinforces the narrative that the only way to deal with rogue states is through force. That plays right into the hands of the hardliners in both parties. On the right, you have figures like Senator Marco Rubio, who has spent years calling for regime change in Caracas, not because it's strategically wise, but because it's politically expedient. On the left, you have a growing faction led by people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that sees US interventionism as a moral failure, but hasn't yet offered a coherent alternative. The result is a policy paralysis, where the US lurches between half-hearted sanctions and half-hearted military threats, accomplishing nothing except further destabilizing the region. Let me give you a concrete example. In 2019, the Trump administration recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president, imposed crippling sanctions, and even flirted with the idea of a military intervention. What happened? Guaidó's movement collapsed. The sanctions hurt ordinary Venezuelans more than the regime. And Maduro, far from being toppled, dug in deeper, forging closer ties with Russia, China, and Iran. Fast forward to today, and the Biden administration has quietly walked back some of the sanctions, not because it wants to, but because it has to, because the policy failed, and because the American public has no appetite for another regime change war. But here's the same people who pushed for the 2019 strategy are still in power, still advising the White House, still whispering in the ears of lawmakers that the only way to deal with Venezuela is to double down on pressure. That's not strategy. That's inertia. So where does this leave us? The most likely scenario is a slow-motion stalemate. The US will keep its sanctions in place, but it won't risk a full-blown confrontation. Maduro will keep playing the victim, but he won't push so hard that he provokes a real crisis. Russia and China will keep propping up his regime, but they won't go to war over it. And the Venezuelan people will keep suffering, caught between a corrupt government and an indifferent world. It's not a pretty picture, but it's the one we're stuck with unless Washington finally wakes up and realizes that the old rules no longer apply. The alternative is a scenario that keeps me up at night. What if Maduro miscalculates? What if he thinks he can get away with something bigger, a direct attack on a US vessel, a cyber strike on American infrastructure, or even a proxy war in Colombia? The US would have no choice but to respond, and once the shooting starts, the escalation ladder is slippery. Russia could send more troops to Venezuela, turning it into a de facto military base. China could use the crisis as cover to make a move on Taiwan. And Iran could step up its attacks on shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, sending oil prices through the roof. That's not just a regional crisis. That's a global one. The good news is that it doesn't have to come to that. The US still has options, just not the ones the establishment keeps reaching for. Instead of more sanctions, it could offer Maduro a face, saving off a gradual lifting of restrictions in exchange for free elections and a commitment to stop harboring Russian and Iranian operatives. Instead of military posturing, it could work with regional partners like Brazil and Mexico to contain the crisis, rather than escalate it. And instead of treating Venezuela as a geopolitical chess piece, it could focus on the humanitarian disaster unfolding there, providing aid and resettlement options for the millions who have fled the country. None of this would be easy. None of it would be quick. But it would be better than a world where every minor conflict becomes a potential trigger for great power war. The real question is whether Washington is capable of that kind of strategic humility. Right now, the signs aren't encouraging. The foreign policy blob is still in charge, still convinced that America's problems can be solved with more force, more sanctions, more intervention. But the world has changed, and the old playbook doesn't work anymore. The Venezuelan submarine incident wasn't just a military provocation. It was a wake-up call. The question is whether anyone in power is listening. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader collapse of America's grand strategy in the Western Hemisphere. For decades, Washington operated under the assumption that Latin America was its backyard, a region where the U.S. could dictate terms with a mix of economic pressure, covert operations, and occasional military interventions. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a relic, it was an operating principle. But that world is gone. The rise of China as a major investor in the region, Russia's renewed interest in projecting power beyond its near abroad, and the growing assertiveness of middle powers like Brazil and Mexico have turned the hemisphere into a contested space. And yet, the U.S. foreign policy establishment still acts as if it's 1989, when the fall of the Berlin Wall left America as the sole superpower. Let me explain why this matters. The Venezuelan submarine incident wasn't an isolated event, it was a symptom of a much larger strategic failure. The U.S. has spent the last 2 decades treating Latin America as an afterthought, focusing instead on the Middle East, China, and Russia. Meanwhile, Beijing has quietly become the largest trading partner for most of South America, investing billions in infrastructure, energy, and technology. Russia has rebuilt its influence through arms sales, intelligence cooperation, and disinformation campaigns. And Iran has used Venezuela as a staging ground for its proxy networks, turning Caracas into a hub for illicit finance and sanctions evasion. The result? A region that was once firmly in America's orbit is now a battleground for great power competition, and Washington is playing catch-up. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. has no coherent strategy for Latin America. The Biden administration's approach has been a mix of half-hearted engagement and punitive measures, with no clear endgame. The Trump administration's policy was even worse. It treated the region as a dumping ground for failed immigration policies and empty threats. Neither approach has worked. Sanctions on Venezuela have crippled its economy but failed to dislodge Maduro, while the humanitarian crisis has only worsened. Military posturing, like the recent naval deployments, risks escalating tensions without addressing the root causes of instability. And diplomatic efforts have been inconsistent at best, with the U.S. alternating between engagement and isolation depending on who's in the White House. So what should the U.S. do? The first step is to recognize that the old playbook is broken. Sanctions alone won't force Maduro out, and military threats only play into his narrative of Venezuela as a victim of American imperialism. Instead, the U.S. needs a long-term strategy that combines pressure with incentives, coercion with diplomacy. That means working with allies like Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico to isolate Venezuela economically while offering a path to reintegration if Maduro agrees to free and fair elections. It means engaging with China and Russia to prevent them from turning Venezuela into a permanent military outpost. And it means addressing the humanitarian crisis head-on, rather than using it as a political cudgel. But here's the: none of this will work if the U.S. doesn't also address its own domestic dysfunction. The political polarization in Washington makes it nearly impossible to sustain a coherent foreign policy, let alone one that requires patience and nuance. Every time a new administration takes office, it tears up the previous one's approach and starts from scratch. That's no way to run a superpower. If the U.S. wants to regain its influence in Latin America, it needs to stop treating the region as a partisan football and start treating it as a strategic priority. The Venezuelan submarine incident was a wake-up call, but it's not the only one. The U.S. is facing a perfect storm of challenges in its own: a collapsing state in Haiti, a resurgent left in Colombia and Chile, and a growing Chinese presence in AMA and the Caribbean. If Washington doesn't get its act together, it risks losing Latin America altogether, and with it, a critical piece of its global influence. The question is whether anyone in power is willing to admit that the old ways aren't working, or whether we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes until it's too late. I've spent my career studying how great powers decline, and one thing I've learned is that it rarely happens because of a single catastrophic event. It happens slowly, almost imperceptibly, as a series of small miscalculations and missed opportunities add up over time. Venezuela is just one of those miscalculations. The real danger is that it won't be the last.